let's talk a little bit about ADHD and autism. So, until very recently, I think it was 2013, uh, ADHD and autism together could not be diagnosed, right? Like a
Yeah.
person having both of them. How do you know that? Firstly, if you could, in brief terms, like explain the difference between ADHD and autism. And also, when a child has both, how does that change the way we look at results? Is it more intense than just having one of it? I asked you a question on executive functioning. I know this is a big issue with people with ADHD. Does this also trouble autistic kids? Because from my understanding, autism is all about structure and routine, right? They thrive in that kind of environment. So do they have trouble with executive functioning as well?
So that's a really complicated question.
If you could tell me the difference between the two first.
Okay. So both of these are really complicated, first off. And as I mentioned before, our understanding of how the brain does anything is still really quite primitive. So you have to take everything with a big grain of salt. When we're thinking about ADHD, we're really thinking about differences in the brain's attentional control system. We're also thinking about differences in terms of how much stimulation a person needs to function optimally. A lot of people with ADHD need a lot more stimulation than your typical person. Like for me, I can tolerate a lot of boredom. My oldest son, no. And that's okay, right? The other piece of ADHD, of course, is the behavioral disinhibition, that being able to put the brakes on. And that system tends to be immature in kids with ADHD. So you have the difficulty sustaining and controlling your attention. You have these executive functioning difficulties. And then for our hyperactive kids, you have issues with self control. And as you mentioned, sometimes that has a pretty big social impact as well. So that's kind of ADHD in a nutshell. Like I said, it's a terrible name because it doesn't really describe the neurodiversity of what's happening there. Now, autism is so interesting because, about 100 years ago, people had these really distorted ideas about autism, that it was caused by mothers. I mean, of course, they thought that every psychopathology was caused by mothers. Mothers
Everything
always,
is the mom's fault.
it's always our fault. Whatever we do, it's our fault. And there were a lot of weird ideas about autism from the last century, that it was actually like pediatric schizophrenia. And oh my gosh.
Can I just ask you a
Yeah, please
question?
do.
So I've heard that autism comes from the dad's side genetically. Especially it depends on the dad's age. Like the older the dad is, because as women we feel scared that, oh, if I have a child in my 40s or 30 late 30s, there may be some problem in my pregnancy. But from what I've heard is that the older the man, the chances of autism are higher. Is this just a myth?
No, there is research on this. Our gametes, eggs and sperm, as we get older, they just don't function as well. In particular, a lot has to happen in that process of fertilization and the formation of the blastocyst, and all the tiny, tiny encodings of genes. There's so many complicated things that have to go exactly right. It's amazing that it ever goes right when you think about all the things that have to happen for, two parents to produce, a pregnancy that survives to term. But there is a very strong genetic component to autism. It's, of course, highest correlation is with monozygotic twins. These are twins from the same egg. High with dizygotic twins. There's a lot of autistic traits that run in families, but it's not like there's just one autism gene. There's a lot of there's like, I think now they're talking about over 100 genes, and some of these genes code for things that impact a lot of different aspects of learning and behavior. And so it's far from simple, because it's pretty hard to, like, oh, we're going to have a whole bunch of autistic rats that we can study in the lab. Well, no, not really, because it's not like, oh, I can make a
Yeah.
rat diabetic, but you can't, and a rat doesn't have language and complex thinking like we do, so it's very hard to study. But there is a strong genetic component. We don't know to what extent environmental factors are also impacting it, but what we have studied extensively is, and I'm bringing up a topic here that's pretty emotionally laden for a lot of people, the science has been really very clear, not establishing a connection between vaccines and autism.
Mhm.
That original idea came from a guy who Andrew Wakefield, who was completely discredited. His motives for perpetrating that myth were not ethical, and the study was retracted from The Lancet. But unfortunately, the fear caught like wildfire. So autism now is being diagnosed differently than it was. So autism and intellectual disability in the last century were really considered pretty synonymous. People assumed that, if you were autistic, you were also cognitively impaired. And as the last century progressed, there was more understanding that there's such a huge range of diversity in terms of how autistic traits manifest, and they're distributed across the population. You have folks who have a lot of autistic traits, and they have what Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen refers to as a pattern-seeking type of brain, as opposed to a more empath type of brain would be like more your neurotypical. But the diagnostic criteria now is really being closely scrutinized, and it should be, because again, it's very behavioral in nature and it doesn't do a great job of representing all the different ways that autistic traits can manifest throughout the lifespan. And, we have to also be thinking about the fact that because someone has autistic traits or meets the diagnostic criteria, it doesn't necessarily have to be a disabling condition. So you can have people who, have autistic traits and they're fantastic inventors, or they're like Temple Grandin, they're out there doing this amazing science. And then you have other people who have a different level of impact of autistic traits, and you have people who are profoundly disabled. And for whatever reason, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual labels everybody from people with the most intense support needs who aren't going to be able to live by themselves, all the way up through the folks who are absolutely brilliant and like graduating from Harvard. They're all lumped into the same category. So that's a mess. And it's really important for us as clinicians to be following the science very carefully, because if you tell me that you have an 8-year-old boy who's going to come see me and they're neurotypical, I can predict a lot of things about that 8-year-old boy. I can predict the likelihood of their IQ score. I can predict what they're learning in school, what they like to do in their spare time. I've raised boys. That's pretty easy. But if you tell me I'm going to come see you and I have an 8-year-old boy who is autistic, am I going to see, a genius who has some quirky behaviors? Or am I going to see a kid who has, again, severe or profound support needs? Autism doesn't convey a lot of meaning there in terms of our ability to use it to communicate. At its core, we're talking about differences in processing social information, sensory input, and different ways of thinking, and that does impact the attentional system.
The empathy, I feel it's harder for them to express that they're feeling empathetic towards someone. I think they may be feeling empathetic, but it's very hard for them to express it, at least from the people that I've seen in my life who are autistic. There's no ill intent. It's just that they find it hard to show it. But
that
again,
can certainly be the case. And no, I love that you're bringing this up, because this is so important. And a lot of people don't ask these questions, but we have to be asking these questions. Otherwise, how are we going to help people, gain a better sense of understanding? So yeah, what you're bringing up as an important point is that for a lot of autistic people, social communication doesn't feel particularly comfortable and doesn't come as naturally as it does to neurotypicals. And so sometimes, autistic folks will be putting so much energy into trying to like figure out how to copy what other people are doing, and that's referred to as masking. And it can just be incredibly stressful. You imagine, going through your day trying to figure out what you're supposed to do at every second so you can be pleasing to others. That doesn't sound like a great way to live, and it causes a lot of stress and burnout. But the concept of how empathic are people and how can they communicate that, there is often, that's part of the autism diagnosis, that there's some kind of social communication difficulty or deficit. It can be both of those. So you have some autistic folks who say things that are very unexpected. Like John Elder Robison, in his book, Look Me in the Eye, My Life with Asperger's, he talked about how he didn't understand why it was okay to say something to somebody like, oh, you got a new haircut, versus, oh, I heard you had an abortion.
wow. Yeah.
So for our neurotypical folks, they have like a much more intuitive understanding of that, but there's no
Social
real
cues.
rhyme or reason to it. And so for somebody who doesn't, you just sort of pull that information out of the air, they find that like this seems like you're on shifting sands all the time. And so socializing can become very uncomfortable and stressful and not that much fun, which is understandable.
Yeah. So there is definitely an overlap between ADHD and autism because some of the symptoms are similar, right? Like missing the social cues and working hard to kind of fit in with
Mm.
the neurotypical people.
Yeah,
When
they're
a
working
child
hard to
is
fit in. Absolutely. You put it beautifully.
because that's what it is about, right? Everybody's expecting you to fit in. And if you're not doing something the way the rest of the kids are doing it, then you're just the odd one out, which is so sad because you could use your ADHD or autistic diagnosis as a superpower. I mean, because I know these people are exceptional in so many ways that neurotypical people are not. But coming to diagnosis, like if a child is diagnosed with both, what do the results look like? I mean, what is
Mm.
how is the diagnosis different from just having one of these?
Oh, it's such a cool question. So, sort of our understanding of the brain differences of autistic people, and I'm actually going to be speaking about this soon. So, I'm so glad you asked. Again, the sort of what's different about neurodiverse folks. A lot of it comes down to their executive functioning system, how they process information, not just fact based information, raise learning, but sensory information from the environment too. And for people with autism, I'm going to speak in generalizations now, they tend to have capacity to hyper focus. And that means to focus like super intensely on something. And it's typically something that is very, very engaging, very satisfying. So, for example, you might find an autistic person who can hyper focus on solving Rubik's Cubes or studying the behavior of light around a black hole. You know, there's sometimes being drawn towards things that are very pattern, inherently guided by patterns and rules and, you know, are very like understandable and technical ways of thinking. Our kids with ADHD, they're often misdiagnosed because people think they can't pay attention, and that's often not the case. So there is that overlap where a lot of kids with ADHD can hyperfocus as well. So these are the kids who can play video games for 5 hours, but can't get through a 10-minute math worksheet. So when you have ADHD and autism, we're really thinking about differences in the attentional system. And in those differences, of course, in various contexts can become disabling. You know, again, school is very one size fits all. And, you know, teachers have big classrooms. And so they're teaching to kind of your average kid. Just like when you buy clothes, most of the clothes on the rack are size medium. And if you're not a size medium, well, the clothes don't fit you. So, for our kids with autism and ADHD, and again, this is common. I'm so glad you brought up that the diagnostic criteria changed. What we're seeing in kids in that population is that they're having a lot of trouble with attentional control. And so they can pay attention to things that are intrinsically motivating, something they're super into. But if they have to pay attention to something that is like boring, so I'll give them, you know, a bunch of boring tasks or tasks where they have to concentrate really intensely, these are harder for them. But maybe during the break, if they get the chance to talk about, let's say, I had one kid who was super into the London Underground, and he could just talk a blue streak about it. It was fascinating. You know, for him, paying attention to that, as hard as that is to, you know, to learn about, no problem. But when I asked him to focus on, you know, sort of tasks that most typical kids had no problem paying attention to, that was really hard for him. And so, you know, a lot of it is all about context because when you go to a classroom, again, one size fits all, the teacher's telling you what you have to do. And if your brain doesn't work in the same way that of all the other students does, then often school's miserable or stressful, or you find yourself getting in trouble or underperforming. And this is where we want to intervene and help people really understand, like, here's who this kid is, here's what they need, here's how they learn.
So is doing the diagnosis for ADHD and autism like harder? I'm sure it must be confusing, right? Because some of the symptoms kind of overlap. Do you find it harder?
Yeah, the DSM is famous for having a lot of symptoms overlap. I mean, you know, one of the common complaints that we have is that the reliability coefficients across diagnostic categories are not good. The head of the NIMH, Tom Insel, back in 2014, when the new DSM came out, he publicly rejected it. So, what's a clinician to do, right? So, thinking about the neuropsychological approach to this, when we do neuropsych testing, it doesn't just mean we're doing more tests. It really means that we're trained to think about brain and behavior relationships. And so what we're looking for is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So we always start with like cognitive profile, strengths and weaknesses. We look at attention, we look at working memory, information processing speed, visual motor. Sometimes we're looking at language and communication, social pragmatics. Often we're looking at academics, because when your brain works differently, you can have areas of academics where you're like amazing and excelling, and other areas where you are really finding it very difficult to get through the sort of one size fits all curriculum. So in neuropsychology, you're really coming at it thinking about, I'm going to use these tests to build my understanding of this person's cognitive profile and who they are. Now, the scores are pretty meaningless if you haven't done a lot of talking with the family about the context. So you really want to understand, what's this family like? What are they like culturally? What are they like in terms of values, norms? How stressful is home? And you want to understand a lot about what's this child's classroom environment like, so that if there's areas where the kid is really struggling, you have an understanding of that. And then you use your test data, you sort of meld the qualitative and the quantitative to get a deeper understanding, again, of like, who is this person and what's getting in their way and how can we help? It's not about, we're just going to slap a label on a kid, collect $1,000, cash the check, and walk on. That was a lot of the way that psychologists operated, but we're in a new era now, and hopefully we're always doing better.
You've done some work in computational linguistics studies show that there are words that can predict how your mental health is, right? Can you talk a little bit about that and explain what you mean by that?
Okay. So computational linguistics, I'll start with that. My husband is a professor of computer science and linguistics at the University of Maryland. And computational linguistics is really using technology to make computers smarter about language, whether it's interpreting language or using language. And everybody's familiar now with like ChatGPT and Perplexity and Claude. These are large language models. This area of language technology has a lot of promise for those of us in mental health, because what I do is very expensive, and most people are never going to be able to sit down in front of a neuropsychologist who can take like 6 hours of time or more to really try and understand them. The idea that my husband and I came up with when we launched a workshop in 2014 called CL-Psych, which is Computational Linguistics and Clinical Psychology, was really trying to build a community where technologists and clinicians could talk about, here's the problems that we have in the field, and here's how technology could help us. So we're thinking about things like, how do we look at someone's natural language and get better at, say, predicting whether or not they're going to die by suicide? Or does this person show language differences that are consistent with depression? And you were just referencing, I believe, the work of Pennebaker, who studied college students, and he found like pronoun use patterns were consistent with depression. They correlated well. And so the types of work that computational linguistics is now doing to help mental health is things like, imagine that every time you went to the doctor, you not only left a urine sample, and I say this because as women, we have left so many urine samples.
Mm-hmm.
But your urine tells a lot about what's happening with your body, your kidneys, your ovaries, so many things about you. And language is also contains a lot of rich information about what's happening with your brain. So a doctor's not going to put you under an fMRI anytime soon, but you can imagine coming to your doctor and saying, hey, I'm wondering if, my kid is presenting with like early indications of autism, and perhaps that doctor collects a language sample. Or let's say you have somebody who is like 18 years old and they're starting to express a lot of really strange ideas and people are getting very worried. You could have a physician or a psychiatrist or a psychologist take a language sample, have an algorithm, do calculations and come up um, with information to suggest that maybe that person might be in the prodromal phase of schizophrenia or might be manic or might have OCD, might be depressed. So this is going to be, I think, the new
Wow.
frontier because scans, it's still very expensive, but the computer technology is not. And so this could really be a game changer for us in terms of identifying people early, screening, and hopefully, being able to intervene before people, have their psychiatric conditions really start to impact their life in negative ways.
Wow, I think this is probably one of the coolest things that is happening in the industry of mental health, though.
It's cool. I mean, but just as these things have so much potential to do many great things, anything that's strong enough to help you is strong enough to hurt you. And so now we have, the negative outcomes of using large language models and chat GPT and such because we're having people who are developing unhealthy relationships with these things or using these things in ways that are increasing their risk of self-harm.
So, Rebecca, to end things, you've written a book. You talk about fostering a sense of pride in the child's unique brain wiring, right? What does that mean? Like, how do you empower your child that, hey, this is your superpower? Because the child does have to go back to school and be around neurotypical children who are constantly making you feel that you're different, right?
So, one of the things that I find very satisfying about my work is if the parents are open to it, we'll do a child feedback. And so, after the testing, the kids are like, why did I have to go sit with that lady and do all that work? We really want to make it a good experience for them. And part of that is taking the time to talk with them about how their brain works. That's really important because otherwise they're sort of left wondering, like, what's wrong with me? And we don't want that to be their takeaway from that experience. We want them to, kind of come out knowing that they have strengths and they have areas of need. And guess what? The adults care about them and love them and see their potential. And so the adults are going to be trying to do things to help them reach that full potential. The superpower thing, for some kids, they really do have an area of very pronounced strength. Not always, though. So, for some kids, their disability really does feel like a superpower. They might be like amazing at math because they can hyper focus, for example, or they may be absolutely incredible at, inventing things or, super duper good at connecting with animals. I mean, there's just such a wonderful range of things that, can be part of a difference that can convey some great stuff. But I'm going to quote Hannah Gadsby, the autistic comedian, in her book, Nanette. She wrote about how important it is to remember that being average is a human right, and not every kid who has a difference or a disabling condition is necessarily going to feel like it's a superpower. For a lot of these kids, they would give anything not to be different. And so we meet every child where they are in terms of how they feel about things. Like my brother and my mother and my father have struggled with dyslexia. And a lot of people talk about, oh, dyslexia is a gift, dyslexia is a superpower. It didn't feel like that to them. It felt like a really hard obstacle and a source of a lot of frustration. So it's very much like on a family by family situation where I might use the word superpower or gift. But again, it's a case by case. And the last thing I want to do if you have a kid who's feeling terrible about what they can't do is be like, you've got this amazing superpower, because you really want to validate that kid's experience and not like get into gaslighting them. So, again, it's just what every family brings to the table, their culture, their background, their particular values, their understanding. And that's part of the job of a good psychologist, is getting to know the family so that the way you present the information to them is going to feel like, okay, she gets us. That's the idea.
Wow. Thank you for that. My last question of the day is, do you think a child should go to therapy who is neurodivergent? Can therapy help?
Therapy can absolutely help. I know there's stuff in the media now like trashing therapy culture.
Oh, I love therapy. I think
I
it's
love
it's
therapy.
it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, if you think about what therapy really is at its core is It's you're using words and experiences and teaching to take advantage of the brain's neuroplasticity. The beautiful thing about therapy is that it really does rewire the brain, and it can bring a lot of relief, and it can really empower people. It can just reduce suffering and help people get through obstacles that have been holding them back for ages. I'm not saying every single person has to be in therapy, and there's a lot of bad therapy out there. Let's be honest about that. There's a lot of bargain basement therapy, or there's therapists who are doing weird stuff they shouldn't be doing. But that we do have a lot of research to indicate that therapeutic interventions, they have a very strong evidence base. They improve people's quality of life. And if you're doing therapy and it does not seem to be working, or you are really not feeling comfortable with that therapist, it doesn't mean that therapy is bad. It may be that you're not working with the right person, or that you need a different approach that's really going to fit with your brain style and your way of understanding the world. It's like trying on shoes. You don't try on one pair of shoes and go, oh, this gave me blisters. I'm never going to wear shoes again. So think of it in terms of sometimes it's a journey.
Okay. Well, thank you so, so much, Rebecca. It's been such an insightful conversation. I've learned so much, and I could go on, but thank you once again for being on the show.
Well, my pleasure, Rishanka. I was so pleased to be asked, and you asked me great questions. Thank you.
If you liked this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. I will be putting all of Rebecca's resources in the description section below, so please feel free to reach out to her. She's a neuropsychologist, so she does do diagnosis and also helps parents with the process after that diagnosis. She also has a book on ADHD, so feel free to read that. I will be putting the link of that in the description. Until then, this is Rishanka Jones signing off. Bye-bye.